Right. I'm joined this week by Carlo properly this time. You can see Carlo actually with his face just over there. So Carlo, round two, good, bad from your end?
Yeah, I think it was a good round in general. I think everyone's settling into TTS, into the event, and also into how to use a Song of Ice and Fire Stats.com in terms of how to submit and things like that. I think everything's improving, and yeah, I think everything's really coming together.
Brilliant. Yeah, brilliant. So there's a little bit of a roundup to start the kind of day with. We're going to have ourselves look at some stats. Now, these stats are available on the Discord. You don't get the full sheet, how we calculate all these and things like that, but they are from the results. And we start talking about a unit and a kind of like an NCU that caught our minds. So I think it was Ranger Trackers, wasn't it, that we were going to mention for a unit? What do you think about that? 73% win rate over 11 games.
Yep, there are units that have just a couple that have a higher win rate, but they are units that have not been played very often, and it's difficult to really make judgments on units when they've got so few games under their belt. But the Rangers trackers have been used 11 times and have won 8 of those games. That's getting into a range where we can start to say this unit is performing very well at the moment.
Hmm.
And in a lot of ways, I'm not surprised. Ranger trackers, when used well, can be an absolute nightmare.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely. It also, of course, is worth mentioning that Night's Watch in general, as you can see from the stats here, Night's Watch in general are doing quite well. So a lot of their units appear in the kind of top echelons. So yeah, I think another big shout out though we were going to make was to Stark Outriders, wasn't it? By far the strongest Stark unit so far by win rate. I think that's interesting, especially given the prevalence of Stark lists. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So Stark Outriders, since their last change, have become an incredibly efficient unit. Um, and again, I think when used well, these units can bring incredible value for what they cost. They're not up there at the very top end; they're costing you just 6 and 7 points respectively, but they can, when looked after, when used right, really bring a lot of return for that kind of value. And of
Yeah,
all the units used, um, only Umber Berserkers have been used more times in terms of actual core units, as opposed to the dogs from Starks appear more regularly. But
mhm.
Stark Outriders are one of the most common units to be selected 18 times, and they've managed to win 12 of those games, 67% win ratio, which when you cut across the whole spectrum of players, every matchup, that's a very high win rate.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, 67% across all the matchups so far and in the games they've played is pretty good. And I think a lot of people who use Stark Outriders, I know that a couple of the guys who are doing very well, people like Lockie and Brett, um, will talk about Stark Outriders quite a few times and probably say, yeah, they are actually pretty decent. Um, and although not necessarily core to a list winning, they give a tool which is very handy to seal victories, I think. Um, okay, so move on to NCUs then. NCU wise, it's an interesting one, isn't it? I think comes as maybe it's probably no surprise to anybody. Walder Frey, 14 times he's been played, and he's won 10 of those games. What are your thoughts on that one?
I'm I'm maybe a little surprised actually that he is that high. That is a very efficient win rate. What I also find quite interesting is that he has been played 14 times already, and yet if we remember back to discussions that we had before the tournament started, he doesn't actually appear in that many lists. So what this is saying is that people are only really including Walder in one of their two lists, but then when it comes to the crunch, they select that list quite often. They
Mhm.
play him quite often, and he is winning a lot.
Yes. Now, it is worth remembering appearing in 15 lists. and then being picked 14 times. It doesn't mean that he's only not been picked once. Obviously, we've got 2 rounds of data in here. But that still means that roughly half of the lists that he's appearing in will be picked on any given round. So that is interesting, I think. Obviously, a big shout out to Lord Varys as well, appearing so far 26 times, by far the most played NCU. Ignoring some of the Stark ones like Arya, as we see at 32 plays. But he's also holding a decent win rate at 16 games, 62%. So Lord Varys, again, looking like a decent pick.
I think the inclusion of Walder is probably saying a lot about the use of units that have a lot of important keywords. I'm thinking maybe Rose Knights, attachments that are very key. And if you can shut off all those abilities, then that is going to get your value back, that 5 points, quite easily.
Yes, definitely agree. The likes of these units that, as you say, have got keywords rather than just strong base stats. They rely on keywords to be useful. Rose Knights are a very good example. Walder Frey comes along and goes, right, I can now deal with you. I've got a turn where I can do something. Okay, so we'll leave it there. We're not going to talk about attachments, and the only reason we're not talking about attachments is most attachments haven't got that many games played. And the ones that do typically have game played are things like commander attachments, which, of course, their win rate is just more or less a function of the faction as a whole. We will look at attachments later down the line, in later rounds, where it becomes a bit more prevalent, but we're going to leave it for this week. So, that'll move us on to our round 3 predictions. A little bit of a forward. We just counted up our predictions from last week. And across the combination, there were 2 split choices between me and Carlo, and between the whole combination, we got 8 out of 8. So 50%.
8 out of 16. Sorry,
8 out of 16,
not 8
sorry.
out of 8.
Yeah.
No, we were nowhere near 100%. We were bang on 50%. You could have closed your eyes and taken a blind pick, and you would have been just as good as us. So there you go. We'll see if we can get any better this week. See if we can spend a bit more time looking at the lists, and maybe if you know how well you did, you could let us know. Tell us if you did any better or worse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm definitely thinking there were some picks there that we thought about. I mean, one of the big, I think, roundup kind of suggestions, we say Night's Watch are doing well. Baratheons actually outperformed on the scenario. They did a lot better, actually, than we had initially thought that they would. So a lot of Baratheon players bring up wins.
I think so. Both they outperformed in terms of what their ranking suggests that they should do from the site, but that was unsurprising because it's generally known that Baratheons are currently recovering from a very low ranking score because of the new units and the historical baggage that they carry. But even from a personal perspective, I think that Renly's side of the faction and the slow Rose Knights did do much better in the game mode than I thought that they generally should. It seems people were much less able to deal with the Rose Knights once they got into that central melee than I thought that they could. And it seems that their movement 4 was less of a concern to people than I think it should be.
Yeah, I mean, referencing one of our other guys, of course, Shalashaska, Daryl did play against the Rose Knights in his game, and he had a real grueling matchup. It went right down to literally the last kind of move, basically, of the game. And you could see the difficulty he was having with dealing with Rose Knights. So check out that video if you wanna see that.
It's a really great game.
Yeah, really great. So we'll move on to our predictions then. So we've got, starting us off with Table 1, we've got a Stark versus Tark matchup. It's Bob Bernard versus Brett Lanfer. What do you think?
We see Howland and Roderick from Bob Bernard playing into Brett Lanfer's Rob and Roos combination. We're playing Dark Winds, Dark Words this round, don't forget. I know this is a game mode that a lot of people are a lot less familiar with than they might otherwise have been. They generally get played less than the other 5 more common game modes. And we will see what the round comes of it. I know there are a lot of issues around the wordings on the cards and exactly how they should interact with this game mode.
Mm-hmm.
But with that in mind, this is most definitely a NCU favored game mode. There is one card in the Secret Objectives deck, which is to destroy the enemy commander.
Mm-hmm.
And outside of Stark Attachment Jaqen H'ghar, who does appear once in the competition, that is going to be impossible to achieve if your opponent brings an NCU commander. And if you bring an on-field commander, then there is a real risk that you are going to give up 4 victory points.
Yes. Remember, obviously, this game mode also requires you to score 2 extra victory points as well, so not the standard 10 but 12. Meaning that games typically will go a little bit longer than maybe many people are used to. You see more 3 or 4, 5 round games in this. You don't see the round 2 or 3 wipeouts that you can sometimes see in other game modes. But I think it is going to be very interesting. I agree. On-field commander, I think, is a risky pick. If you look traditionally, something like Free Folk who don't have the choice of an NCU commander typically do worse on this game mode compared to the other ones. Obviously, still doing very well. They're very, very good faction. But yeah, I think this matchup is going to come down to a lot to player skill, really, isn't it? You see Howland and Roderick choices versus Rob and Roos. It wouldn't surprise me if Bob Bernard picks up Howland and Brett picks up Roos, and we see how that goes, really.
Yeah, I think we expect to see both take their NCU commanders here, unless one of them is not happy about the exact specifics of that mirror matchup. Both of their NCU commanders army lists are running 10 activations. That is the kind of numbers that anybody outside of Free Folk and Stark literally just can't achieve. They're very important in terms of giving you the range of options that you need to be able to score different points in this game mode. I fancy Howland over Rob, in my opinion. I think, over Roos.
Mm-hmm.
I think he is a good commander, and he has good synergy with the list that I'm seeing here from Bob Bernard.
Mm-hmm.
So just when you look at the lists, I'm favoring Bob.
Favoring Bob. Okay.
There
Yeah.
is a lot of basically versatility. There's a lot of versatility in Bob's list. We see a lot of cavalry units. They're also between the dogs and the outriders. They're also very important for allowing things like foregoing of actions while on an objective to claim.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that Walder doesn't have a huge role to play against Bob's list.
Mm-hmm.
There is the great axes with Bran and Hodor, but that's going to require some very specific timing. But between the Cranigman trackers, 2 outriders, and then those great axes, I think he has a lot of options.
So, he is playing against Brett. Brett is obviously known in the community. Do you think that? I mean, Bob Bernard is a relatively unknown character. Those of you who are playing in the tournament will know him from playing against him. Do you think Bob will win? Do you think Bob can beat him with the better list, in your opinion?
Both Brett and Bob, to the current, in the current past 2 rounds, they've both gone crushing victories, significant wins, huge unit destroyed numbers. So I really don't think that we can say with any reliability, despite how well known Brett is, that Bob should be considered a worse player here.
Yeah.
So if in this matchup, I'm gonna have to say that I think that Bob can take it.
Cool. So that'll be Bob Bernard for table 1 from us. I tend to agree with Carlo here. Okay. So that moves us on to table 2. It's So Cisgender versus De Border. Lannisters versus Starks. So, what do you think about this one?
I think it's interesting that when we look at the Stark versus Lannister matchup in general, we see quite a favorable 60% win ratio to the Starks.
Yeah.
That obviously sits in the Stark's favor. When we then go and filter by Dark Wings, Dark Words specifically, that becomes a 70% win ratio.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that from previous stats that we can see, this definitely looks like something that the Starks play into more. And like I say, I think that comes down to the versatility that the Starks have and how they basically can fulfill more of the scenario objectives than the Lannisters can in general.
Yeah. So I think it is interesting. Starks versus Lannisters is a well-played matchup. Obviously, both of them coming together in the starter box. It's where a lot of people start the game. 126 games in total, just from the recent patches. I think 1.5, right, where you started counting these. So 126 games since 1.5 of Stark versus Lannister, and Stark are winning 60%, as you say. So I think this is a fairly confident statistic to get behind. I think it's really interesting, again, looking at your little pie chart here from the site. Crushing defeats. If Starks lose, it tends to be a really bad loss. Whereas winning, yes, there's a lot of crushing wins, but when they win, they typically, there is a variance of wins. Whereas when they lose hard. So do you think that says a lot about player skill? A lot within that, and saying basically that when Lannisters are beating Starks, it's generally speaking because they're better players and they really know how to win that game.
It could do. I mean, the other side of things on that is that when you look at all those stats, the Starks just crushing win the game mode over 50% of the time themselves.
Yes, of course, yeah.
So, and also I think it generally just tends to lead towards the fact that a huge number of games submitted are crushing victories in general. When you look across all the different factions, effectively 60% of all results are crushing wins versus crushing defeats.
Mm-hmm.
So for the better factions, that's basically going to be represented at them winning a crushing victory about 35% of their games and losing a crushing defeat about 25% of their games. And then that stat is generally reversed for those weaker factions. There's a few in the middle who maybe they play a more consistent game, and across the board, it's maybe more like 55% of their results
Mm-hmm.
are crushing one way or the other. But still, like the vast majority of games are crushing final results, and we see very narrow and standard wins only happening about a quarter of the time each.
Yeah, okay. All right then. So, I mean, going back to the actual matchup then, so cisgender versus de Border. Obviously, so cisgender is relatively unknown. I think again, de Border being someone you played against over the weekend in the show match.
I did.
As Lockie Carter from Australia. So cisgender seems to be posting, relatively good stats with his lists at the moment, though. He's one of the few, if not the only Lannister player so far to get 2 crushing wins.
He's the only Lannister player with 2 wins at all.
Yeah, so the only Lannister player with 2 wins at all, and a healthy kill ratio to go with it. One of the better ones from those top 2 crushing victory, the kind of like the top double crushing victory people.
Yep.
So, do you like so cisgender's odds here? Or do you think that de Border with the better list with a higher percent win rate, that Lockie will probably take it?
So what I like is I do like so cisgender's high sparrow list.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for me, like I say, I would like to pick a high sparrow list into this game mode, whereas the border is fixed into picking one of his 2 Rob lists. He
Yep.
does have to play a field commander.
Mm-hmm.
I played against him in this specific game mode, using one of those specific lists just at the weekend, and he surprised me in terms of how patient he was, how much control he had over the game mode, and how well he understood it, and the fact that even though I was 5-0 up in VPs at the start of the game, he didn't let that panic him, and he knew that there were objectives that he would play for later in the rounds, and if he gave himself enough options for what came up, he would be able to bring that score back, and it ended up in a really close 12-11 victory to him.
Yep.
So the border definitely knows the game mode well and knows Rob well. What comes into question here is in the previous 2 rounds, so Cisgender used Joffrey.
Yes.
And I would be nervous about playing Joffrey into this game mode. Although it is high scoring, playing towards 12, there are basically very specific objectives which must be achieved to score VPs in general. And so having a unit with a big target on it that says I am worth 2 VPs at all times, as opposed to I'm worth 3 VPs versus 1 VP for most other units. Don't forget, basically, VPs aren't generally scored for destroying units in this game. Unless you know how to really use that bait, really use the fact that you are worth 2 points as something that you're going to get a lot of value out of. I would be quite scared to play Joffrey myself, and I would be much more comfortable playing High Sparrow. And it's a question of whether or not Cisgender is as comfortable with his High Sparrow list as he is with his Joffrey list, considering he's played Joffrey in the past 2 game modes. Even though I wasn't hugely happy back then with the choice to play Joffrey into Clash of Kings either.
Yeah. So I think the one thing that could be said about one of DeBorder's lists, it does run Rickon, of course, as well, which you can't be affording to give away that VP there. So I would probably see DeBorder's first list with his double cavalry, the one he played against you, picked for this game mode. And as you say, I'd probably expect to see the High Sparrow picked up for Cisgender. I think those are the wise picks. And then do you think Lockie DeBorder will win that just based on the factions and based on decent lists, or do you think Cisgender's High Sparrow list really has a good shout?
I think the Stark list and the Stark faction just has a strong edge in this matchup. It has so much more versatility for what can come up. Obviously extremes of the cards can come up in this game mode, but I believe that when you cover as many bases as the Stark list does versus the more specific kind of focused single element of the game that the Lannisters play towards, I think you're just hedging. You're limited in what you need to come up for you to get a win.
Yeah. So I think that kind of seals it for me. I think we're saying DeBorder.
I think he has strong activation control and also just so much more maneuverability that he will be able to get where he needs to be to claim the objectives when he needs to claim them.
Yes. Okay, that leaves us down to table 3, Mahoney's Law versus Ariakas. So that is Night's Watch versus Stark. Stark being the constant here. Night's Watch versus Stark then. What do we think?
Ariakas running Howland and Eddard. Again, Howland's something that I would like to see. We see here again a 10 activation list Starks, and he's going to be playing into Jorah or Othel. Obviously, we will never see Night's Watch. Well, outside of maybe a complete conscript spam, you will never see Night's Watch achieving any kind of activation parity with that Stark list. Othel provides a reasonably high 8 activation list for the Night's Watch.
His other
Between
list with Jaw is also 8 actually.
So he has a pair of 8 activation lists. That's very high for Night's Watch. Both have 3 NCUs. Quite important in the game mode if specific secret objectives come up for controlling specific zones of the board. That also may play against the Night's Watch, who already want to be controlling very specific zones for their vows. So if they're torn between these ones that provide VPs versus these ones that will provide them on-field bonuses, then it might play against them quite a bit. I would. The problem with the awful list in my mind is that it's not as versatile as the Starks are. The Scorpion crew, while very very dangerous when in position, it can't react to the changing objectives as well as a high mobility list like the Starks.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely agree. And talking about in terms of like some of those objectives to get across the board. I mean, Swarm Brothers being the fastest unit by the looks of things. He's got a unit of Ranger Trackers in his awful list. But of course, whether or not they'll be, maybe or not, whether or not they'll be great in terms of some of those objective points. I think looking at fast units, it's looking at Swarm Brothers really as the fast units to get across the board and gain positionings to get those like those weird victory point conditions that you can sometimes get in Dark Winds, Dark Words with number of charges and things like that.
Looking at the statistics for Night's Watch, Night's Watch are basically the worst faction across the stats history for Dark Winds, Dark Words.
Yeah.
They themselves only have a 25% win ratio in the game mode. This is atrocious, basically. To put it simply,
they've never won a game against Starks on this game mode.
Yep, in the history, they've never managed to. In the history of the submissions that that the site has, never has it gone to the Night's Watch favor. Across the 20 submissions for Night's Watch in the game mode at all, they've only managed to pick up 5 wins. Obviously, this is one of the lesser played game modes, so we see a lot less submissions for this than other things. A lot of these have come though from the very competitive Masters of Westeros tournament.
Yes.
So we did see Night's Watch in significant numbers there have to play this game mode, and they did nearly always lose. Basically, I don't think that this is going to go their way. They do not have the versatility to react the way the Starks do in this specific matchup. But more to the point, when you think about the strength of Night's Watch in general, it's always a relatively blunt force. And that just doesn't play well into Dark Winds, Dark Words.
Yeah. It sounds like we've made our prediction there then. It sounds looks like we're siding with Ariakas and his Stark list, probably his Howland list, assuming he picks that up. So that goes down to Ariakas for round 3. Okay, that moves us down to table 4, and it is our old friend Shalashaska with his Night's Watch versus Furioku's Free Folk. Furioku running double Harmer. The changes between the lists. One list runs a Savage Giant, slightly less activations. One list runs a lot of skin changes. Those are the predominant differences between the two lists. What do you think? What do you think about this one?
Free Folk are very strong across the board in all game modes in general. Dark Winds, Dark Words is no exception to that. The only real problem that they have from the stats that we have is Fire and Blood. But Dark Winds, Dark Words, they're coming in at 61% win ratio. Interestingly enough, I just looked. It's really we're down into not having enough submissions for this game mode for these factions, kind of in a specific matchup. But in a Night's Watch versus Free Folk Dark Winds Dark Words, there's a 50% win ratio.
Yeah.
50-50 goes both ways. We have ourselves a crushing victory and and then a narrow victory through into a narrow defeat and a crushing defeat. So a bit of everything has happened in that matchup in the past. But really, with 4 results, that's not enough to make any kind of make any big takeaways from.
No.
You know, all it would take is one of those to be different for us to be sitting here talking about the fact that one has a 75% win ratio over the other.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, so until, like we always say, you know, until we're talking like at least more than 10 results, single entries will make such a huge swing.
Yeah.
But when we're talking about the factions in general, Free Folk have played well enough into a 61% win ratio, and the Night's Watch only down there at that 25% win ratio.
Yeah.
So I, again, don't think that we're going to see the Night's Watch buck the trend here. They might, across the whole board, across the tournament, increase that win ratio from where it is at 25%. But in any given match, I still think that they are not Paul the favourites to win the game.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you there. I actually know both these players. I've played against both of these before. Know Daryl obviously very well, but Frioco I've had lots of chats with, and lots of played against him as well, and he's been doing very well in the tournament with his Free Folk. He's one of the few Free Folk players actually that has stood out as somebody who is winning games consistently. I don't think there's a single other Free Folk player in the top 8. So Furioku is a good player. I think that's worth pointing out. Obviously, Free Folk are generally considered a good faction, but I think it's true also to say that if they were that good in this tournament, they'd be winning more games. So Furioku versus Shalasavska. I'm a Free Folk player, and don't get me wrong, I like Daryl. You know, we chat with him, but yeah, a little bit. I think we have to give it to Furioku.
I agree. Yeah, I think just on the balance of things, I can't bet on Night's Watch in this game mode at all. You'll see that come up again and again. If Night's Watch come up, then I'm gonna go with the other player, I think.
Yeah. So there we go. Furioku for table 4. Table 5, we've got Stannis 1000th Lord Commander versus Seismaj. Again, Stannis 1000th Lord Commander, Baratheon. He's one of the 2 Baratheon players in the top 8. So Baratheon, although after Stark, very high pick rate, he's one of the only remaining Baratheons in for contention to win. What do we think about this matchup, Baratheon versus Nightwatch? I'm pretty sure I know what your answer is going to be already.
Yeah. Despite the fact that Baratheons have all this historical baggage, as we keep saying, in terms of what their win ratio is, they've never done particularly badly in Dark Winds, Dark Words. Stannis 1000th Lord Commander is not running in either of his lists the complete secret weapon, as it were, for the game mode, which would be Alistair Florent.
Well, interestingly,
he allows complete control over the tactics board, which no other NCU can provide in that same way to take those secret objectives that require it.
So interestingly, Alistair Florent, you mentioned him there. I think it is worth remembering one of the first things we mentioned, I think all the way back when you did a stats release on Small Council Radio, Alistair Florent was not picked by anybody. So
that's how I didn't even need to look at those lists to know that he wasn't running Alistair Florent, because nobody's running Alistair Florent. What he does run is he runs Axel Florent as a commander, backed up by Melisandre and Shira Errol. And we see a double R'hllor Faithful, double Wardens, Stormcrow Archers. This is paired with a Renly Charismatic Heir with 3 units of Rose Knights, and then the Bolton Bastard Girls with Brienne the Blue. As much as I think that the Rose Knights are tough, obviously, I think that there is more versatility in the Axel side of the list. He can apply pressure early thanks to Melisandre, and there are also places in the list in the secret objectives. Sorry, for things like every time a unit fails a panic check. There are lots of things for every time you successfully charge. So I think that this again is kind of, it favors a list that isn't just static and isn't just going to react. It's a very proactive game mode. You need to go out there, claim objectives, claim ground, and be willing to charge and remove units from pain points, get rid of things that can score points, all the while kind of not trying to give up points yourself depending on what objectives come up. It doesn't play well into this idea of just, I'm just going to sit here and make you beat me, because that is not going to score you any points in the game mode in general.
Yes. Yeah, very, very, very true. I do think you mentioned Melisandre there, and I know that Melisandre is always a talking point within the community. I think it adds a little bit of pressure onto the other player a little bit as well to make plays, to try and do something with the victory conditions out there. And it gives her a little bit of reach to, as you say, to get maybe an extra panic check here for an extra VP. Whereas, this nuking units thing that people seem to be afraid of is not actually that important, because of you don't get victory points for it. I think it's worth mentioning as well, for those of you who are worried about Melisandre, let's just quickly show you this stat. And I don't think we need to say anything about it so far, but I think that should tell you about, is she OP or not. I'll leave that one for the community to think about, and for angry responses in the comments, no doubt.
Yeah, angry reacts only. But Melisandre being used in a competitive environment is not winning.
No.
As simple as.
Yeah. So, you might not be happy about that, but that unfortunately is just the case.
I think there's a whole different discussion, a whole separate discussion to be had around the fact that she does, I agree, bring a relatively negative play experience to the game. But all the people who are complaining about her, I think they need to take a second think about whether or not their complaints are about her negative play experience, which I don't question at all. But I do question, I think people, they articulate their negative play experience as a question of whether or not she's overpowered and unbeatable. And the stats show that she's just not overpowered.
Yeah.
Subjectively, you may not enjoy the game. And that I can't deny or doubt, and I completely see your standpoint on it. But objectively, from the statistics, she's not overpowered. So you need to decide if your complaints are based more around the way she affects the game being played and making it not enjoyable for you to play that game, but what you think you see is an overpowered unit.
Yeah, I agree. I completely agree with everything that's said there. So I think it's worth addressing that, because she obviously appears in this list, and a lot of people might be saying, "Oh, he's got Melisandre, he's going to win." Me and you are sitting here saying he's got Melisandre. Actually, currently, as things stand, he's more likely to lose.
Statistically speaking, he's going up against it because of Melisandre.
Yes. So we'll leave that one
But she has a place in this game mode. She may be able to apply pressure to a unit that you otherwise couldn't reach, because you really need to get a certain unit off a certain objective at a certain time, or anything like that can be very useful here. So being able to apply pressure at the right time, and she can spike some damage in the right area of the map, because Dark Winds, Dark Words in general is about applying your resources at the right times and in the right place. And can you get the right units and the right things into the place they need to be ahead of time, so that when the objective comes up, you're already ready for it.
Yeah.
And she does take away from that need, because she can apply her pressure wherever she needs to at any given turn.
Yeah. Okay, so we talked a lot about Stannis 1000th Lord Commander there. We've got Seismaj up next. He's Frioka's teammate at Puff Gaming. Frioka from Table 4. Nightwatch, he's your Jaw Offal. Is there anything you really want to talk about, or should we just go straight into prediction and move on?
Nope, nope. I'll be so surprised if Night's Watch can buck the trend. They shouldn't. They don't have the versatility in this game mode. He has some conscript lists with the Stone Thrower, but I don't think it has the right use here. And particularly against Melisandre, because I think you will find yourself on the wrong end of well, I'll sit here and blow up your unit by panic, and you sit there and blow up my unit by damage. But Melisandre's at the sacrificing a few wounds, which isn't to be naysayed. But at the cost of sacrificing those wounds, she is actually probably more reliable than the Stone Thrower for doing that. Obviously, the Stone Thrower itself is immune to Melisandre not being able to take panic checks.
Mm-hmm.
But Melisandre is immune to the Stone Thrower being an NCU and not on the board at all.
God, wouldn't that be good? Launching a stone at an NCU. Oh,
Exactly.
Bring that into the game. That's OP.
Again, I can never bet on Night's Watch in this game mode if I believe in the statistics at all, and I do believe that we have enough here to say that this isn't good for Night's Watch.
So yeah, only two games of this played, so it's not worth looking at this particular statistic. But as you say, 100% for the Baratheon, and that fits in with the rhetoric saying that Night's Watch struggle in this game mode. Okay, so that looks like we're putting it down to Stannis 1000th Lord Commander. Want to make a big shout out to Seismaj. This was one that me and Carlo disputed in the last predictions, and I said Seismaj, and Carlo, in his inferior knowledge over there, said Luther Blue, I think it was, and clearly I am much better at making these predictions.
Clearly.
I'll get it in while it lasts. Trust me, there'll be one coming up. Right, so that moves us on to table 6. Griffyn versus Codfather. Night's Watch again, this time versus the neutrals. So Night's Watch we've talked about. Donald Offal, so slightly mix up of commanders, but not significantly different. Codfather, Roose and Ramsay, though. I think this is worth talking about.
Neutrals have had a bit of a rough week, actually, in terms of the statistics in general. They used to be sat in second place just 1 week ago in terms of the power rankings. They have gone from, in 7 days, they've managed to lose themselves.
Close to 7.
I can't see 17. That. Yeah, they've lost nearly 17 ranking points. That's quite a significant number. We always talk about, obviously the bigger the number, if it's negative, the worse it is for you. But what can be said very simply is that they used to be considered the second most powerful behind Free Folk and above Starks and Night's Watch. But Stark and Night's Watch both gained themselves about 10 points this week, whereas the neutrals have dropped by 17, and they've dropped themselves down into both a negative overall value and a negative, down into 4th place. Mm-hmm. Their win ratio has dropped below 50%, and obviously that's all not good for them.
No. But it comes down to it, free neutrals versus Night's Watch. You would suggest that Night's Watch obviously slightly higher. I mean, I think the difference is something like -4 to +3, I think. So probably a difference of about 7 or 8 points, which is not a huge difference, really. I mean, far eclipses.
In terms of a difference between two factions, obviously losing 17 points yourself in a week is quite a lot, but a difference of 7 points is we're talking like less than a 1% win ratio difference. We're talking 49 to 51% in terms of if you accounted for every game mode, if these two matched up, what should their win ratio be?
Yeah. So I mean, so really, realistically, it's going to come down to a lot more to player skill. Is it worth looking at Dark Winds, Dark Words, though? Oh, neutrals.
Dark Winds, Dark Words isn't particularly strong into the neutrals. Yeah. They again are suffering with only a 37.5%, 37.5% win ratio. Sorry. There is a single game submitted between Night's Watch and neutrals in Dark Winds, Dark Words, and it was won by the neutrals. Across all game modes, you could maybe also have a look at that, which is that neutrals do not fare very well against the Night's Watch in general, only winning 40% of the time. For me, this might come down to the fact that the Night's Watch are similar to Stark. They are just that one morale better across the board, which is quite a big deal when you're talking about panic tests. You're talking about vicious keywords on the cutthroats. You're talking about panic tests made from the tactics board, made from Bolton Blackguard, and all these things. They don't really. They have a much lower chance of succeeding against a morale 6 unit than they do against a morale 7 unit.
Yeah. I can see that, that it doesn't really play into the neutrals' favour, and you're likely probably to see the Ramsey list, I'm guessing, rather than the Roos, as you say. And I think that Codfather, although again a strong player, I think he's probably going to struggle. I think.
The neutrals are not entirely unversatile,
no,
but they lack the number of choices in unit selection. Particularly when you're basically reducing your selections down to Boltons only.
Mm-hmm.
You've got a single aggressive infantry unit, you've got a single defensive infantry unit, and you've got a cavalry unit that lots of people are now saying is the worst cavalry unit of all the choices in the game since its last set of reworking, shall we call it. They've lost a lot of their staying power in terms of really grinding effectiveness in a static combat. On top of that, every NCU that they can take, their opponents have their own factional ones plus your NCU choices, so that can be quite oppressive too. Petter Baelish, though, does work similarly to Alistair Florent in this game mode, in that he can allow some tactics zone shenanigans, shall we call them, in terms of taking the zone effect that you want while covering up something else, which might be what scores you the VPs.
Yeah.
It's a tough one. I don't like either of these factions particularly, and I don't see a list which really screams out to me as the winner. Roos for Codfather, we're talking about 5 combat units and 2 NCUs, or we're talking about 5 combat units that are all pretty bare bones. We only see a single attachment in the Stormcrow Archers, which gets it for free, plus the NCU commander and 2 other NCUs. So we're seeing that 8 activations there with 3 NCUs, 5 combat units. It does seem like the more obvious choice, but at the same time, Petter Baelish might be quite important, and he's not running that list.
Yeah.
What can I say? What else have we got? What do we have on the other side?
So Griffyn's list, his Othel list he has played twice. Veterans, Ranger Trackers. What else has he got? Double Ranger Trackers, actually, and
triple Ranger Tracker. 2 NCUs, Othel and Jura.
And in his O'Donnell list, he runs Corrin and Jor. He's only got 2 NCUs there. I think he's going to really struggle on the NCU control board then. Taking those objectives, holding those objectives he wants to take for the points if they come up, but then not really being able to do anything else with those. He just takes those and that's it. Yeah, he can use those zones, but
I think it's a tough one, and I am gonna go against all of my own previous kind of promises, shall we say. But I'm going to give it myself to the Othel Night's Watch list. I think in amongst 3 units of Ranger Trackers, you have got some versatility there for the game mode, which I don't see in any of the other lists. I think the other lists, the other three lists, all kind of play into a singular mindset. Whereas the veterans can provide a lot of staying power if you and a lot of damage at the same time. But the healing of those watch recruiters mean that they can really just go out there and fight by themselves. You don't have to worry about them. Whereas the ranger trackers are going to allow you to put out 3 vulnerables in a turn. That's very important because there is that objective in there, which is going to be to have 3 of the same condition token on different units at the end of a turn.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the key scorers out there. The ranger trackers, being cavalry, can get to where they need to be and give up activations whenever they need to score on those objectives.
Yeah.
And I think that is maybe going to be more important, that onboard versatility and the mixture he has between some maneuverability and some staying power is going to be more important than the 3 NCU list brought by Roos.
So it looks like you're saying Griffyn.
I'm going to say Griffyn with Othel myself.
I'm tempted to say Codfather. I really think that Codfather has potentially more options. And the overall win rate, Dark Winds, Dark Words for neutrals being 37.5. I know, although a small sample size versus the 25% for Night's Watch, does strike me that extra 12.5%, although not significant. It's only over a relatively small number of games. I do think that that's going to play into it, but then I'm also drawn by your matchups. I think Griffyn takes it. I think he does. Yeah. He's also played that triple Ranger tracker list 2 times already with 100% win rate, but Codfather's run his Roos list twice with 100%, so we'll see. I think this is going to be a good one. I think this is going to be gritty.
Yeah, I think. Well, I mean, obviously, it will depend what objectives come up and how versatile and how experienced these players are with the game mode. Knowing this tactics deck is going to be 70% of the battle. Being able to predict what might come up next, rather than just playing for what's on the board right now, is where this game mode takes its next level from.
Yeah.
Obviously, you've got to play for what's available, but you need to leave open the options for what might come up soon.
Yeah, I agree. Okay then, so we will put that down for Griffyn, and we'll move on to table 7. So, Ferrin versus Mystery Knight, table 7. So Ferrin, he's playing Stark, and Mystery Knight is the remaining victorious Targaryen player. So we've talked a lot about Starks. It's Howland and Robb. Was there any surprises in these lists, or are you just happy to move straight on to Mystery Knight's Targs?
I haven't looked at them yet.
You haven't looked at them. Let's have a look at them
then. We see Howland paired with only a single other NCU. That is kind of that is rare, considering that the Starks have access to a pair of 3-point NCUs. Well, that's left him with is
10 activations in both of his lists.
That's left him with 8 on-field units.
Yeah.
That's Summer and Shaggy Dog for 2 of them, but that's 6 real 12 wound units on the board. That's a lot of coverage, a lot of options, and between trackers, swan swords, cutthroats, and outriders, there is a lot of different ways to approach a combat, different ways to control the board.
Yeah.
Over in the other list, we see maybe what might be considered a more usual high activation list with 3 NCUs, 3 very expensive NCUs, particularly for the Starks. We see Caitlyn, Walder, and Sansa. That's going to bring you in at 12 points, considering that you could, with Howland, pick up 3 NCUs at a cost of 6 points plus your commander. To spend 12 is quite significant, but he's still able to put out 7 combat units thanks to Grey Wind and Shaggy Dog.
Yeah. He's played that list twice or so far in the tournament, 100% win rate, of course. So his Rob list has probably got more experience with in the tournament, but I would probably think he'd like to play his Howland list, I'd have thought.
His Howland list is quite extreme, but yes, I mean, it's been a long time outside of Free Folk that I ever saw saw a list that had 6 full units. Never mind the 4 other activations between the dogs and the NCUs. We're not even talking about the fact that it is 10 activations. That's not too rare in itself, but that 6 of them are fully fledged, battle ready, 12 health, 12 wound units is quite surprising.
Yeah, that's 72 wounds to chomp through if you were to wipe him. That's not including the 2 dogs, of course, which is another 4.
Mm-hmm.
That's a lot of wounds. Jeez.
It is, yeah.
So we'll move on to Mystery Knight then. Mystery Knight and his Targaryens. Running Roose and Ramsay. 8 activations with Roose, 7 with Ramsay. He's run Ramsay so far twice, obviously winning both of his games. Are we likely to see his Roose list, do you think, here?
I think that the Ramsay list is very strong into Targaryens, and he is currently. So in the last week, we've seen Grey Worm get a significant jump up, and in Grey Worm's short history on the site, he's yet to lose a game. But in general, I think that Ramsay previously has been the best pairing for Targaryens, and you can very much see why. He can add some real spike damage, and I think that he synergizes so much better with the Targaryens than Roose does in general.
Mm-hmm.
But it's an NCU favored game mode, and if Mystery Knight has brought Roose, there must be an intention behind it. And so this must be one of the game modes where he will be expecting to run Roose.
I mean, it's worth remembering at this point. I mean, with the Targaryens so far, with a win rate of sub 40%, which is not great overall. Dark Winds, Dark Words, only 10 games played on the site, but 60% win rate.
Yeah.
It is.
Of all the game modes, the Targaryens are only being able to perform and keep up in Dark Winds, Dark Words, and Winds of Winter. They do have the versatility that's needed to kind of cover these game modes. And as I keep saying versatility, but to be honest, we could just swap that word out with maneuverability almost.
Mm-hmm.
Maneuverability, taking 2 activations, taking 2 actions in 1 activation, being able to get where you need to be to apply pressure at the right time are the keys to this game mode. And that is very important here, and is why Targaryens have been able to keep up in these game modes, despite the fact that their raw power output, their raw options, have been lacking by comparison to all the other fully fledged factions. They have, it's worth just this week, they have finally slipped below Baratheons in terms of their overall power ranking.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't take them losing too many points, but actually, maybe Baratheons has just recorded another loss since I last looked, which means that Baratheons might have gone back down below. They have swapped a couple of times in the last week.
Yeah.
Really, it's a question of the Baratheons look like they're trending up in general, while the Targaryens are continuing to trend down a little bit. I think it's just a matter of time before the Baratheons overtake them. But the Baratheons are still recovering very slowly. I think people overestimate how powerful they are.
Mm-hmm.
They're not doing well in the NRG event, and I think people see the raw stats of some of their units and don't see the flaws.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. I know there's a lot of conversation about Rose Knights, and I think it's probably worth noting Rose Knights at the moment. They're not doing badly in terms of win rate. I'll just find them on my list here. So they are 16 games played and 9 wins, so just above a 50% win rate. But that's not exactly impressive for a unit that a lot of people have been saying is amazing. Oh wow, it's incredible. It's really strong for 7 points. It turns out that either the lists they're in are not proving that very well, or maybe they just aren't the kind of real powerhouse units that people think they are. Um, so okay, so we talked about the Targs there. Targs versus Starks, obviously the win rate, it is, aside from Free Folk, which is down at sub 15%, that's awful. Starks have got, against Starks they have a 33% win rate. What do you think in this matchup then?
So I think specifically, what's actually the question here is Mystery Knight really playing Targaryens, or is he actually half playing neutrals? And should all the things that we think are wrong with neutrals be applied to these Targaryen lists?
It's
They
true.
both have a lot of points spent in neutrals. The Roos list specifically spends 20 of the 40 points in neutrals. Bang on the amount that you are allowed to spend.
hmm
That comes in the form of Cutthroats, Blackguard, and then Varys.
hmm
Well, are the Unsullied and their movement 6 maneuverability going to be able to make up for the fact that most of these Targaryen wins, most of this Targaryen versatility, otherwise known as maneuverability, has come from the fact that they have always been forced to take a ton of cavalry units?
hmm
But Mystery Knight does not have a ton of cavalry units in his lists. He has a single one, either the veterans or the screamers,
hmm
and he has a single unit of Unsullied, movement 6 infantry. When you add Daenerys in one of the lists, you can talk about movement 7, which is really going to
Scary.
have a large threat range, but you don't have the double activation, which can be very important. You don't have
It does.
the free maneuver into repositioning yourself, getting where you need to be. All you have is a more of a blunt arrow. I'm going to march 14 inches on you kind of movement.
The um
So
the Daenerys list
I,
does run Illyrio for the double activation there, I guess a little bit to like take the counter off, but I know what you mean. It's not inspiring when I look at this list to think about it. Um,
yeah, I think it deviates from the Targaryen core, which is otherwise done well in this game mode.
mhm. One thing I do want to
It's a
say
tough
though,
one.
I want to say that the Unsullied Swordmasters might find a little bit of a home here. You talked about the high maneuverability. Sure, they don't get the repositioning in the same way, but they can't take counters. And
That's very true.
and you know, and some of the objectives. I mean, if you're running his second list with Ramsay is only 4 combat units, double cutthroats, the Unsullied Swordsman with Ramsay and Vets, which means that in order to get that 3 counters on the board condition, you have to put them on everything that isn't the Unsullied Swordsman, unless you're somehow turning off their abilities. Um, that's actually a fairly big ask, I think, because they're not all going to be within range of the things that can give these counters out. Um, all right then, so let's make our final call for this one. What do you think? What do
For
you
me,
think?
it's going to be Frerin with his Howland list. It
Yeah.
is a bit of a surprise list to me to see that many combat units on the field. And I think it's just going to give him options that Mystery Knight doesn't have.
Things like lots of charges, point for every charge. You're making 8 charges potentially in a turn. Obviously, that's crazy assuming that's going to happen, but that's a lot of victory points just for one objective coming out. All right, so I think I would agree. Frerin probably takes that one. That moves us on to table 8, and we've got Lapin Maniac and against Larks. It's Baratheon versus Stark. We saw Lapin on stream the other day play against Chris Eustace. Very good game there. Lapin kind of clinched that one in the final kind of coupling turns. Sealed the deal a little bit, shut Chris out of the game, but it was good. I fully recommend you watching that one. Baratheon versus Stark. Is there much else to analyze or say, or is this kind of going to go back to what we've spoken about before?
I think what's interesting about Lapin's Baratheons here is, particularly on the Renly side, is that he runs Loras. And not as most people in the event are running Renly Charismatic Heir. There are a few also, a couple of Renly Lord Commander, I believe, Lord Paramount, sorry.
Yeah.
But he is running Loras, and I think when you look at Loras in isolation, he does not look particularly strong, and you also might think that he doesn't quite have the synergy that Renly Renly Charismatic Heir has with the Rose Knights, with Renly leaning incredibly heavily into that defensive healing mechanic, the embolden, helping them pass their morale checks, and all that kind of stuff. But what I think is very interesting is that I think that Loras is helping to cover up a lot of the Rose Knights' flaws rather than leaning even more heavily into what are already their strengths.
Yeah.
So if you can cover up the flaws of the Rose Knights, I think that that is actually a more important role to fulfill than it is to make these Rose Knights even more of an immovable block, because they are already pretty immovable, sorry, kind of immovable. He wants to provide a new dynamic for them. He can provide some aggressive output. He can make you scared of both your attachments being killed, your losing your commander. That'd be interesting in this game mode. You wouldn't even have to destroy the commander's unit. Loras on a 3+ might even just be able to cut him out the unit.
Yeah.
And what we see is Loras steadily rising in terms of ranking points, and Renly is continuing to go down. Renly Charismatic Heir, despite the addition of Brienne the Blue, despite the addition of the Rose Knights, he is still going down.
Minus 19 this week.
Minus 19 points. He is the biggest loser for the week in terms of ranking points. The Baratheons themselves are very slowly rising, but he seems to be holding them back massively. There are a number of commanders that are doing well. We see Courtney Penrose up there. We see Loras up there. We see newer Renly, Lord Paramount up there. And then we see a few on the Stannis side, possibly because he's just not quite run as often. And they are all dragging the Baratheon rating back up, but Renly is almost as quickly pulling it back down again. So I think that people need to get away from Renly Charismatic Heir myself. I think that that list, while very strong and oppressive to play against, doesn't actually win enough games to be worthwhile.
Yeah. Yeah,
that was a whole. Just realized how much of a whole segue that was, because Lappin isn't even running Renly
not.
Charismatic Heir. But I think it's very interesting that he is running Loras, and he is having success with him. His other list is going to run a very expensive 13 points of NCUs in Melisandre, Cersei and Shireen, and Tycho Nestoris. He's backing that up with, as we nearly always see, a pair of R'hllor Faithful, some Wardens, and only 4 combat units.
Yeah. But actually, I mean, in some ways, that's a positive in this kind of game mode where, you want... If there are less targets, it does make things easier in terms of, like, a lot of frontage, and you can get some nice overlaps. We saw that kind of game played out with you versus... Lockie the other day. But actually it does make a lot of the objectives very hard to score. Putting lots of counters on units. Well, if you've got virtually no units, I can't apply lots of these things, because you can just you can constantly like heal or target one unit, and that's you're actually kind of focusing on 25% of your force. It makes it a lot harder to spread these tokens out. Getting those 3-on-1 becomes very difficult. So those two objectives almost come out the window. Lots of charges again becomes difficult, because there's only 4 units to charge. So, it really, I think it depends a lot on which list he plays. But I think you're right. I think Lappin having spoken to him, and Etienne is a really nice guy, actually. He was really pleasant to talk to, and he's been great, doing quite a few things for us in the back scenes as well, and community-wise stuff. Seems like a really top-on bloke. And I really think he understands the Baratheons a lot more than a lot of other players do, and he really plays into their strengths. So I think he's actually one to watch, not for this tournament necessarily, but one I would keep an eye on off the back of this tournament. I like to think that he's going to take Baratheons a long way.
Yeah, like I say, I think playing Loras is a higher level of understanding
Hmm.
of the Baratheon strengths and weaknesses than playing into Renly charismatic air.
Yeah. So let's make our final call. It is obviously Starks, his Larks playing his Starks, in retaliation. Um, what do you think? Do you think this is going to go to Baratheons or Starks?
After all that talk, I still think that the Stark toolkit in this game mode is really high.
Yeah.
They do have a 60% win ratio across a lot of submissions, and his list is a high activation Howland list, lots of dogs, lots of versatility, and I just don't think that the Baratheons have the maneuverability, even in their aggressive Stannis side of lists. So I have to stick with Starks, and it is also worth stating, Lapin just scraped a win last round. He did only just get the narrow margin of victory,
Yeah.
whereas Locks is sat on 2 crushing wins.
Yeah.
This matchup comes because one of those victories was to his opponent resigning very early in the game, which is
Hmm.
something that really does start to mess up tournament standings and something that people really shouldn't do. If we were more strict to the tournament guidelines, the player who resigned shouldn't even score any tournament points, not as opposed to the one that you generally get for losing a game. And that's because it starts to unbalance the event in terms of pairings and matchups, because Larks is considered, of all the players who have won 2 games, he is considered the lowest rated of them all because he barely scored any VPs in the game in which his opponent resigned.
Yeah. Um, so I think we're saying Larks for this one. Um, but
Yeah.
we think this again could be quite close. And I think I think a big shout to Etienne, Lapin, Maniac. I would watch him not just for this tournament. I think we'll see him in the top 8 after after this round. I think he'll go on to get some good wins under his belt. I wouldn't be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised if we see him as one of the, if not the top Baratheon player, if Stannis 1000th Lord Commander obviously continues like we saw earlier. But I wouldn't be surprised if Lapin's up there with Stannis 1000th as well.
It's interesting that you talk about that, in that there are a pair of Baratheon players up here with 2 wins, but neither of them have managed to achieve crushing victories in both game modes. Whereas between Starks, Lannisters, Night's Watch, they all have managed to do that, 2 crushing victories in both games. Don't forget that Baratheons are the second most popular faction picked into this tournament. So anything that the Starks can achieve, really, in general, specifically anything that the Night's Watch are achieving, the Baratheons should be able to achieve, because they have more entrants for Baratheons than there are for Night's Watch.
Definitely, definitely. So I think that seals it though. We are saying Larks for table 8. Now we've got obviously table 9 through to table 32 still to go. Me and Carlo won't be analysing them in this video, just because there's so many. We could be talking about this for years, honestly. We would, with that kind of people. Was there any particular ones you wanted to mention, or any like overall feelings from the remaining tables?
No, I'll be interested to see how Baratheons do at this game mode across the board.
Hmm.
I also, like I say, I expect that Night's Watch at 25% win ratio, that is really, really bad, and I would like to see if it holds. If it improves, then I think that's a very good thing, because for them to have that lower win ratio in a game mode is not brilliant for kind of terms of balance to the game in general.
Hmm.
There are really, if you could say that you don't like this as a competitive game mode for certain reasons, which I can understand that you feel like you don't have as much control as over the objectives that are going to come up as in other game modes. You can't plan for them as well. But personally, as I've been quite vocal about, I think that that's more because you're not planning for things that may come up before they even arrive. But what matters to me more is I don't like a game mode as a competitive, from a competitive standpoint, if it almost effectively says that a certain faction can't win anymore.
Yeah.
And if you're going to add a game mode to a tournament and it basically says Night's Watch can't go undefeated because they have such a low win rate in one of the game modes, then they're going to have to get incredibly lucky to just win that round. Then I think that that's a problem for competitive meta in general, not what people's feelings on what is a competitive objective or not, or whether or not it's too random. I think it's more to do with people need to understand that lots of things are taken out of their hands, or they're fighting a very favorable or very bad matchup as soon as the round draw is made for who their opponent is and what the factional matchup is.
It's usually what we would say statistically about Clash of Kings and Free Folk, right? On the flip
Yeah,
side, you play against Free
yeah.
Folk in Clash of Kings, like we saw a lot of the Free Folk players actually not win this particular Clash of Kings game mode, which is a bit of a buck to the trend of stats that we've seen. But then we saw Furioku with his Free Folk. He absolutely crushed the floor with his opponent in that game mode, which is more akin to the stats we typically see. And you know, these very swingy game modes. I like Clash of Kings as a game mode. I mean, I play Free Folk, right? But I like the idea. I like this idea that you can play and it's about a big battle where you just keep bringing in more and more reinforcements and it's about grinding these wins out. But I will also sit here and say I do clearly think it's in balance. I don't think it's a competitive matchup personally because I wouldn't like to see myself playing Clash of Kings in a competitive environment. Um, because I feel like it would just be like, well, this is unless I do something silly or unless my opponent's far better than me, I don't see how I can lose. And that, for a tournament wise, yeah, sure, it puts me one more victory to winning the tournament. But really, like, is that what I want, or do I want to be beating people who I think are good players or having good games with players where we've having to think and having to play and actually having to compete rather than going through the motions and winning in 3 or 4 turns?
And whatever else you might say about it, dark winds, dark words makes you think.
Yeah, it does. Of course, it does. That's one thing it always does. So we've got 2 more questions that Carl and the West Coast Bannermen have added this week. Dark Winds, Dark Words is known for high VP totals. So how many total players will score less than 10 points? Conceding counts as winners scoring more than 10 and losers scoring less than 10, unless losing players already scored 10 or more. So how many players will score less than 10 points do you think across the whole 32 tables?
So I guess if we're talking about 32 tables and 64 players, so
Yes.
winners and losers,
How
if
many
that's the
total
question.
players will score less than 10 points? It can conceding counts as winners scoring more than 10.
Mm-hmm.
I would definitely
I
say that
would be
I think every
go.
winner will go over 10 points.
Yes, I agree. I
So
think
32,
that
32 is a guarantee.
Yep, unless we get some very negative play styles where neither player is playing for the win at all, then I don't think that the winner will be any less than 10. There are 3 objectives in play at any time, and they have some pretty high score counts on them. You pretty much just want to come into this game mode looking to score 3 points a turn, I would say. Obviously, you do the best with what you can, with what's available. But sometimes you might only be able to pick up the 2. Other turns you'll pick up 4, or even complete more than 1 objective. But really, you just want to look at those 3 and say which ones can I score some consistent points on without making a huge risk, while denying my opponent easy opportunities to score points back. So yes, I think that we will see people easily get those 3 points a turn when they're winning the games, and that they will be at 12 by round 5.
So across the board then, 32 players guaranteed then, we think. how many of the remaining 32 players, so the losers of the games, for want of a better term, how many losers do you think will get to that 10-point limit? I guess we could use the stats website for this, right?
I guess we could. We could look at every. Well, we could look at every different faction, and unfortunately, you can't really search by game mode. You can only look at each faction and its history in a particular game mode. We could look at each faction and basically what its results in Dark Winds, Dark Words are.
And we look in the size of
That
the
might
result,
give
right?
us.
The narrow victory is probably going to
Yes,
tell us.
exactly. Narrow victory would be when, in this game mode, would be both players probably getting up over that 10 points. Not necessarily, it could be a 10-12, and it asks getting over 10, I believe. Does it say over 10 or under 10? Does it talk about what 10 is?
10, so over 10 or under. So 10, as it says here, the question, how many total players will score less than 10 points?
Less than 10. So basically, a narrow victory at 12-10 will be both players getting over 10.
Yeah.
Interestingly, it has a much, just from free folk, it has a much more balanced. It has a much more balanced win rate. It's nowhere near as many crushing victories, although under neutrals it looks much more crushing. Let's see what we find. Starks are crushing victories over half the time. And when, as you say, sorry, that was in their Lannister specific. Yeah, they're still at that 35% crushing victory versus 25% crushing defeat. More than half of them are crushings. The narrow ones, we're only talking about 10% of games are narrow wins
Or
for the
20,
Starks in this game
20%
mode.
if you include the 10% narrow losses as well.
Mm,
I think then, looking across the board, it seems to be around about 20% of games from the factions that we've seen. Obviously,
yeah.
Baratheons are probably a big one to look at as well because they've got, yeah, so 10 and 9 there. Let's have a quick look at Baratheon. So, Dance with Dragons, Dark Winds, Dark Words. It's looking a lot higher actually with Baratheons, at almost nearly 40%.
Yeah.
But we're looking at, should we say about 30% of the game we'd expect to be narrow?
Oh, I think that for me that's
Maybe it's
for me
20%.
that's generous. Yeah, I'd say
20%.
25 at best, 20, 25.
So if we go for 2025, it's how many players will score less than 10 points. Well, 32 is gone, and then it's so 32 is the remaining number, and then of that we'd expect 80% of that to be crushing, probably. So, oh, mental maths, isn't it? So 10% is about 3, so 20% remaining. So probably about 6 players will probably score narrow victories. So that's over 10 points, 10 or more points. So should we say around about 24 players? 24, 25 players, maybe it's 20, 23 players will probably score less than 10 points. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, I could go for that. Yeah. I would hope that as the tournament progresses, we do get more of those narrow victories as we start to get these players playing against each other, where the skill differential is supposedly narrowing. We're supposedly getting the best players against the best players, and the less top tier players in the event being matched up against each other. That is also true of the lists that they've brought. Maybe some people are bringing what they might consider a more casual list, or maybe they're trying a new faction for the first time. So as the matchups progress, we should get people having closer and closer results, and that hopefully is how a good tournament format works and what Swiss always tries to achieve. Swiss is always trying to pair up people who it thinks are most closely matched, and then make a judgment from that, which is similar to the way stats, the ELO of the stats site works in general. It wants to look most importantly at two players who are similarly ranked, and then find out who wins the game, and then make a big change in their rankings based off that, because that's the most information it can really learn.
Yeah. One thing we didn't take into account is obviously the second question. victory through combat isn't an option in this game mode, but of course you can still win by killing all of your enemy units. Um, do you think many people will win by killing all enemy units?
I think that setting out to destroy your opponent in this game mode is entirely the wrong way to approach it. But if the objectives are not going your way, if the secret objectives are not being what you need, then you can apply pressure by threatening to wipe your opponent out. You can force them to start to take actions to keep themselves on the board, whereas they might want to take other actions in general, you know. So applying pressure with that is important. But I think that it's basically a Hail Mary play for when you're losing badly to try and recover a result in this game mode specifically.
Interestingly, there were only 7 destroy all or surrenders, of course, it could have been, in round 1. None in round 2 is what you'd expect with Clash. Do you think we'd see as many as 7 in victory through combat destroy all enemy units, or do you think it's going to be lower than that?
I should think it will be lower than the 7.
What do you reckon? Should we go for about 3?
Um, yeah, my instinct was 2 or 3. So
Yeah,
yeah, three is generous. If we're not including
should go 2, I think.
resignations, which I really hope that we won't see, um,
We're not. It won't
yeah,
be. It won't be resignations. I'm assuming. Um,
yeah. So we're talking about true victory through combat, or true destroying all opponents' combat units
yeah.
results.
If
I
we
would
look
expect
at
it to be very low.
if we look at true destroying all combats, it looks like there might be 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 of those overall games were destroy alls. I think only 2 were surrenders by the looks of it. So 5 destroy alls in round 1. So I think 2 to 3 is probably a good bet for round 3. I'll go 3. I was tempted by 2, but I've changed my mind back to 3. I think. And I think that's it. So yes, that's all of the things done. I will fill in my own guesses for table 9 through to 32, as I'm sure Carlo will do his. So yeah, that'll end our kind of like breakdown of Unit 3. Sorry, round 3, not Unit 3. Was there anything else you wanted to go through while we're recording, Carlo? Comments in general?
No, I think everything's taking off well, and the number of submissions to the site is going really well. So if you enjoy us being able to talk about the statistics like this, if you want to look at them yourself, there is so much more information out there. We just scratch the surface. There isn't enough time to talk about everything that you could analyze from it. But it's all only made possible as long as people submit. So I always just tell people whether they care about the rankings or not to submit results. If you care about rankings, then obviously you're going to need to get your opponent to verify your results, and that's something that's improving. Lots more people are verifying their results than they used to. But don't forget to remind your opponent to log on too to get those verifications in, because without them, then the power rankings don't reflect the history properly, because although the win will be recorded in the win-loss ratios, it won't do an ELO calculation on who what the rating changes should be until the result is verified.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to say is obviously a big shout out to everyone in the tournament at the moment. One of the things I noticed from round 2 was that no one surrendered. No one just gave in and said, look, I'm not winning. Every person looked like they played the whole game out. And I think that's a big plus to every competitor out there in the tournament, so well done for that. Generally speaking, I think in terms of like sportsmanship and gamesmanship, I think has been good. I haven't had that many instances where there's been, I can't think of any this week where there's been genuine complaints or anything like that. Rules questions are being dealt with quite well. I know that we deal with them when we're available. Of course, we're not available 100% of the time. So I think that's going really well. And aside from that, I think the community's really going great. I think there's more videos, more people streaming stuff, more people just viewing stuff. Um, we're throwing on like random ad hoc streams ourselves now of games that aren't really planned, and we're getting viewers coming online and watching them. So the community really is building, and I think that's really good to see.
Yep. Just as a final thing, just a reminder that all of the TTS event, while it's mostly run by myself on a song for iceandfirestats.com, it is of course sponsored by NRG and Mythico Studios, Carl Kirsten's Peacekeeper Games, which I guess is now effectively West Coast Bannerman, and Small Council Radio as well. All of these people have helped to make both the event known to the community and also provided real tangible prize support, which is hopefully going to make its way to all the players who kind of meet the varied criteria. Some are obviously for winning the event, doing as well as possible, but there are plenty of other prize opportunities in the event, and we will probably see the first prize given out at the end of the next round, with one of them being the person who achieves the worst result in Dark Winds, Dark Words. I was trying to, shall we say, blunt the blow of having played Dark Winds, Dark Words and not enjoyed it. Trying to get in there ahead of the backlash of what Dark Winds, Dark Words has already been. But like I say, a lot of great like community creators are involved in this event, and if you can give them any of those sponsors your support, be it Mythicos are now working almost entirely from a mail order perspective during the lockdown. Small Council Radio has been getting a lot of great guests on. That's not myself. And they're doing they have some really interesting chats on there about the meta. They talk a lot about the competitive scene and what you should be selecting and thinking about in a competitive environment. And Carl has always been a big supporter of Song of Ice and Fire Stats.com. Even before it was a website, he helped my algorithms for how we determine these power rankings back when it was just an idea I had and an Excel spreadsheet. So I can never say thanks enough to Carl for that. And who else have I missed? Oh, and of course, Chase from On the Table Gaming. On the Table, without their help and support when I first launched the site, it would not have been able to grow to what it is now. That initial exposure was what really got anybody submitting any data. Before that, it was effectively just me and a few people I'd managed to cajole into using the site by just constant berating them to submit their results. Back when it represented nothing but effectively my own local meta. So Chase really importantly got it out there and got a whole load of new submissions, and I'll never be thankful enough for that.
Yeah, no, brilliant. I think you've hit everyone there. Obviously, big shout out to NRG as well. Me and Carlo are members of NRG ourselves. Obviously Scott and Daryl being there as well as kind of like helping out, TOing. Obviously both of those guys performing in the tournament as well. So big shout out to the rest of the NRG guys and good luck with their games for round 3. And yeah, overall, I think that finishes us here. So we'll catch you next time, guys, where we'll be catching up with round 3 summary and we'll start doing round 4's predictions. Take it easy.